1. The threshold of stone and starlight. There is an hour before dawn when the world holds its breath. It is neither night nor morning, but something older. A pause between endings and beginnings, when the last stars still burn faintly and the horizon carries only the memory of light. It is said that in this hour the veil between what is seen and what is felt grows thin. And it was in hours such as these, thousands of years before the first word was written, that unknown hands began to lift stones toward the sky. We do not know their names. We do not know the sounds of their language or the prayers they may have whispered, but we know what they built. Across the rolling hills of prehistoric Britain, across the windswept plains of Ireland, across lands that would not carry borders for millennia to come. They raised monuments of such weight and precision that we are still, after all these centuries, trying to understand why. Perhaps the question itself is the beginning. Who first looked upward and decided that the stars were not merely lights, but listeners? Who stood on a hill in the deep silence of night and felt for the first time that the heavens were watching back? We cannot know. But somewhere, in some forgotten valley, where the mist rises like breath from the earth, someone made a decision that would echo across thousands of years. They chose to build not for themselves, but for the sky. Imagine the labor. Imagine dragging stones heavier than any cart could carry across distances that would take days to walk. Imagine shaping these stones with tools of antler and bone, smoothing their surfaces, carving their faces with spirals and circles, whose meanings would dissolve long before anyone thought to write them down. Imagine generations passing, grandparents teaching grandchildren, who would teach their own grandchildren, all working toward a monument that none of them would live to see completed. This was not the impatience of our age. This was something else entirely. A patience so vast it almost resembles love. The temples they built were not temples as we understand them. There were no altars for sacrifice, no idols to worship, no priests in robes collecting offerings. These were thresholds, doorways, places where the world of breath and bone met something vaster, something that moved in cycles too slow for a single lifetime to comprehend. The stones were not walls to keep something out. They were gates to let something in. And what they let in was light. In the mist-wrapped valleys of what is now Ireland, there stands a mound older than the pyramids of Egypt. Newgrange, the archaeologists call it. Though that name is new, barely a few centuries old. The people who built it left no name at all. Only stones. Only darkness. Only a narrow passage that runs deep into the heart of the hill, pointing toward a horizon that matters only once each year. On the morning of the winter solstice, when the sun rises at its lowest and weakest point, something remarkable happens. A shaft of golden light enters through a small opening above the doorway. A roof box, carefully constructed, precisely angled. The light travels down the passage, minute by minute, until it reaches the inner chamber. And there, for approximately 17 minutes, it illuminates carvings that have waited in darkness for an entire year. Spirals, circles, shapes that have no names we know. This alignment is not accidental. The builders knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the movements of the sun with a precision that would not be matched for thousands of years. They built not for a single sunrise, but for countless solstices stretching into a future they could not imagine. And the passage still works. After 5,000 years, the light still enters. The stones still remember what they were made to do. Whispers tell us that they buried their dead within these chambers. Bones have been found, carefully placed, accompanied by offerings of carved stone and polished beads. Perhaps they believed that the solstice light would wake the sleeping dead, if only for a moment. Perhaps they believed that the spirits of their ancestors could travel along that beam of gold, returning briefly to the world of the living before fading back into the long darkness. Or perhaps they believed something we have no words for, something that existed before belief itself had a name. Across the water, in the chalk hills of southern Britain, other monuments rose. Stonehenge is the most famous, but it was not alone. Across the landscape, hundreds of circles and standing stones marked the earth like scattered seeds, each one aligned with some celestial event. The midsummer sunrise, the midwinter sunset, the extreme risings of the moon that occur only once in a generation. These were not random placements. They were conversations with the sky. The builders watched. That is what we must understand. They watched the heavens with a patience we can scarcely imagine. They noted where the sun rose on the longest day and where it set on the shortest. They tracked the moon through its complex cycles, its slow drift north and south along the horizon over 18 years. They observed the stars, the Pleiades rising in autumn, Orion climbing the winter sky, and they marked these observations in stone, not in words. Words would come later, but in geometry, in alignment, in the patient placement of massive stones that would outlast everything else they made. It is said that the blue stones of Stonehenge were carried from Wales, over 150 miles away. Why? No one knows for certain. Perhaps those particular stones held sacred power. Perhaps they came from a place where the veil between worlds was especially thin. Perhaps the journey itself was the point, a pilgrimage of stone, a labor of devotion that gave the monument its meaning. We are left with questions, and perhaps that is exactly what the builders intended. Beneath the silence of these monuments, there is something that still hums. Not a sound exactly, more like a presence, a feeling that the stones are waiting for something, that they have always been waiting. The spiral carvings found throughout these ancient sites appear again and again. At Newgrange, at the tombs of Orkney, at passage graves scattered across Europe. No one knows what they mean. Some suggest they represent the sun. Others say the journey of the soul. Still others believe they are maps of states of consciousness, patterns seen in trance or dream, visions brought back from the threshold between waking and whatever lies beyond. Perhaps all of these are true. Perhaps none of them are. Perhaps the spirals meant something so fundamental to those ancient minds that it needed no explanation. Like breath, like heartbeat, like the turning of seasons that everyone understood without being taught. What remains is the carving itself, the patient work of hands that have been dust for 5,000 years, shaping stone that will outlast us all. And so, we come to the end of this first threshold, not with answers, but with an image. Imagine standing inside a chamber of stone on the longest night of the year. The darkness is absolute. The cold seeps through everything. You have waited through the night, through the slow turning of stars you cannot see, through hours that feel like years. And then, at dawn, the first light appears, a thin line of gold at the entrance. It grows, moment by moment, creeping along the floor toward you. The spirals on the walls begin to glow. The darkness retreats. And for a few precious minutes, you stand in a place where time itself seems to pause, where the past and future meet in a single shaft of winter light. What did they feel, those ancient watchers? when the light touched the inner chamber? Relief? Joy? A grief too deep for tears? We cannot know. But something in us responds to the image. Something in us remembers, even if we cannot say what. Perhaps that is the gift they left us. Not knowledge, but wonder. Not certainty, but the sacred uncertainty of standing at a threshold, waiting for light that comes only once a year, trusting that it will come again. The stones still stand. The alignment still holds. And somewhere, in the deep blue hour before dawn, the sky still bends low to whisper to those who remember how to listen. 2. The astronomer priests of Heliopolis. There is a place beneath the crowded streets of modern Cairo where something ancient still sleeps. You cannot see it from the surface. The traffic passes over it. The markets spill their noise across it. The living city has long forgotten what lies beneath. But once, before the pyramids at Giza had yet risen from the desert, before Alexandria was even a dream, this ground held the most sacred temples in all of Egypt. This was Heliopolis. Iunu, the Egyptians called it, the city of the sun. And here, for more than 2,000 years, a brotherhood of priests watched the sky with a devotion we can scarcely imagine. It is said that the temple of Ra at Heliopolis was ancient even to the ancients. The pharaohs of the Old Kingdom came here on pilgrimage, seeking wisdom from priests whose order stretched back into the mists of pre-dynastic time. The Greeks, when they finally arrived, called the city Heliopolis and marveled at what they found. Libraries of astronomical records, calendars of impossible precision, and men who had spent their entire lives studying the movements of stars. But all of that is gone now. The temples were dismantled, stone by stone. The libraries burned or scattered. The obelisks were carried away to Rome, to London, to New York, where they stand today as orphaned monuments, far from the ground they were meant to mark. What remains in Heliopolis itself is almost nothing. A single obelisk, still standing. A few scattered blocks, and the silence of a place that once held the keys to time itself. Let us go back. Let us return to the twilight hours of a world that no longer exists. Imagine the temple precinct at dusk, when the sun, Ra himself, the god these priests served, began his descent into the underworld. The great pylons cast long shadows across courtyards of polished stone. The sacred lake reflected the first emerging stars. And on the observation platforms, the astronomer priests prepared for their nightly vigil. They came in white linen, purified by rituals we no longer fully understand. They carried instruments of wood and bronze, Merkhet tools for sighting the pole star, shadow clocks for measuring the hours, water clocks that dripped with patient precision through the long darkness. Their heads were shaved. Their bodies were clean. For what they were about to do was not merely observation, it was communion. The sky, to these priests, was not empty space scattered with burning gases. It was a ceiling of lapis lazuli, across which the gods themselves walked in slow procession. The sun was Ra in his golden boat. The moon was Thoth, keeper of wisdom and time. The planets were wandering deities whose movements carried messages for those trained to read them. And the stars, the imperishable ones as they were called, were the souls of the blessed dead, circling eternally around the pole that never set. To watch the sky was to watch the gods. To record their movements was to transcribe divine will. and to predict their future positions was to glimpse the fate that awaited kings and kingdoms. Of all the stars they watched, none mattered more than Sirius. The Egyptians called it Sopdet, and they observed something remarkable about its behavior. Each year, spring turned to summer, Sirius would disappear below the horizon. For 70 days, it would be invisible, lost in the glare of the sun. And then, just before dawn in mid-July, it would rise again, a brilliant blue-white flame on the eastern horizon, appearing just moments before the sun itself. This heliacal rising of Sirius did not merely mark a date on the calendar. It announced the most important event in Egyptian life, the annual flooding of the Nile. Within days of Sirius returning to the sky, the river would begin to swell. Waters that had traveled from distant mountains in the heart of Africa would pour across the floodplain, depositing the rich black silt that made agriculture possible. Without this flood, Egypt would die. The entire civilization depended on waters arriving at the proper time, in the proper amount, and the star Sirius, faithful beyond all human comprehension, announced its coming year after year, century after century. The priests of Heliopolis understood this connection in ways both practical and mystical. They developed calendars based on Sirius, tracking not only its rising but its relationship to the solar year. They noticed that the heliacal rising drifted slowly through the seasons, taking approximately 1,460 years to complete a full cycle, a period they called the Sothic cycle, a span of time so vast it humbled even the longest-lived dynasties. They were, in their own way, measuring the breadth of eternity. The instruments they used seem simple to us now, but their precision was extraordinary. The Merket was a plumb line and sighting tool, used to establish true north by observing the circumpolar stars. With it, the priests could align temples, pyramids, and obelisks with an accuracy that modern surveyors still marvel at. The Great Pyramid at Giza, whose construction was guided by knowledge preserved at Heliopolis, is aligned to true north within a fraction of a degree, an achievement that seems almost impossible given the tools available. The water clock, or clepsydra, allowed time to be measured through the night when sundials were useless. Water dripped from one vessel to another at a constant rate, and marks on the interior showed how many hours had passed. The priests calibrated these clocks to the stars themselves, creating a system of timekeeping that worked regardless of season or weather. And the obelisks, those great needles of stone that have become symbols of Egypt itself, were not merely monuments. They were shadowcasters, solar instruments that tracked the movement of the sun across the sky. The shadows they cast at noon marked the seasons. The shadows at dawn and dusk marked the solstices. They were, in a sense, frozen light, stone records of the sun's eternal journey. Whispers tell us that the priests kept archives of their observations stretching back centuries, perhaps millennia. They noted eclipses, planetary conjunctions, the appearances of comets. They recorded anomalies and patterns, building a picture of celestial behavior that would not be matched until the astronomical revolution of early modern Europe. And they did all of this not for curiosity alone, but out of sacred duty, the belief that understanding the heavens was understanding the divine. What happened to all of it? The decline was slow at first, then sudden. As Egypt passed from native rule to Persian, then Greek, then Roman hands, Heliopolis gradually lost its importance. The Ptolemaic kings built their own temples, favored their own priests. The Romans, when they came, were more interested in spectacle than scholarship. The obelisks were too beautiful to leave in place. They were uprooted and shipped across the Mediterranean, trophies for emperors who understood nothing of what they meant. The temple buildings, no longer maintained, began to crumble. The sacred lake silted up and vanished. And when Christianity became the state religion, the old ways were not merely abandoned, but actively suppressed. The libraries that had preserved thousands of years of observation were scattered or destroyed. The priests who had kept the vigil were forced to convert or disappear. By the time the Arab conquest came in the 7th century, Heliopolis was already a ruin. The new city of Cairo grew up nearby, and over the centuries, the ancient site was buried beneath farms, then houses, then the sprawl of a modern metropolis. The ground that once held the most sacred temples in Egypt became ordinary, forgettable, lost, and yet something remains. Not in stone, but in echo. The knowledge of Heliopolis did not entirely vanish. It passed to Alexandria, where it mingled with Greek philosophy. It influenced the astronomical traditions of Babylon and Persia. It may have shaped, in ways we cannot fully trace, the very foundations of Western science. The calendar we use today, the one that gives us 365 days with a leap year every 4, was first developed in Egypt, refined by the priests of Heliopolis over countless generations of watching the faithful return of Sirius. The obelisks still stand, though far from home. In Rome, in Paris, in London and New York, they cast their shadows as they always have, marking the passage of the sun across foreign skies. They no longer remember the rituals that once surrounded them, the prayers that were spoken at their base, the priests who calculated their precise alignments. But they endure. Stone endures. And somewhere beneath the streets of Cairo, beneath the noise and the concrete and the forgetting, the ground still holds what little remains of a city that once read the will of heaven in the movements of light. Beneath the silence, the vigil continues. Perhaps it was never meant to end, only to wait, patient as the stars themselves, for those who remember how to look up and wonder what the sky is trying to say. 3. The chamber beneath the Serpent Mound in the rolling hills of southern Ohio, where the forests turn to copper and gold each autumn, there lies a creature made of earth. It does not move. It does not breathe. And yet, those who have stood upon the ridge above it speak of something alive in its presence. A stillness that feels like waiting. A silence that feels like watching. The great Serpent Mound stretches nearly a quarter-mile across the landscape, its body curving in 7 deep undulations, its tail coiled in a tight spiral, its mouth open wide as if to swallow something we cannot see. It is the largest serpent effigy in the world, and no one knows with certainty who built it or why. It is said that some places hold memory in ways we do not fully understand, not in words or monuments, but in the shape of the land itself, in the way a hill rises, in the direction a river bends, in the curve of earth that someone long ago decided to make sacred. This is such a place. Let us approach it slowly, as the builders might have wished. Imagine an autumn evening, when the sun hangs low and golden over the Ohio Valley. The trees are aflame with color: red maple, yellow hickory, the deep bronze of oak. The air carries the smell of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. And there, along the ridge above Brush Creek, the serpent lies in perfect stillness, its curves catching the last light in ways that make the earth itself seem to breathe. From the ground, you cannot see the full form. The serpent is too vast, too close to comprehend. You walk along its body and feel only the gentle rises and falls of shaped soil, 3 feet high in places, 20 feet wide. It is only from above, from a height the builders themselves could never have achieved, that the true shape reveals itself. A serpent in motion, undulating across the hilltop, its head aligned with a point on the horizon that matters only twice each year. On the summer solstice, when the sun sets at its northernmost point, the light falls directly into the serpent's open mouth. Some believe this was intentional, a calendar written in earth and sky, marking the longest day with a precision that seems impossible for people without metal tools or written mathematics. Others note that the coils of the body align with other astronomical events. The winter solstice sunrise, the lunar standstills that occur only once every 18 years. The serpent, it seems, was watching the heavens. And perhaps the heavens were watching back. Who were the builders? This is where certainty dissolves into mist. For many years, scholars believe the mound was created by the Adena culture, who flourished in the Ohio Valley more than 2,000 years ago. The Adena were mound builders. They constructed burial mounds throughout the region. Earthen monuments to their honored dead. But recent studies have complicated this story. Radiocarbon dating of materials found at the site suggests the serpent may be younger than once thought. Perhaps built around 1,000 years ago by the Fort Ancient culture, who lived in these hills centuries after the Adena had faded from memory. Or perhaps both are true. Perhaps the site was sacred long before the serpent took its current form. Perhaps generations of people, separated by hundreds of years, added to and reshaped what they found, each leaving their own marks upon a place already heavy with meaning. The land itself offers clues. Beneath the serpent lies an ancient crater, not from a meteor, as some have suggested, but from a crypto-explosion, a geological upheaval that shattered the bedrock millions of years ago. The builders could not have known this in scientific terms, but they may have sensed something different about this ground, something powerful, something that demanded attention. Whispers tell us that indigenous peoples throughout the region held this place in reverence long before European contact. The serpent was not merely a monument, but a keeper, a guardian of something we can only guess at. What dreams were dreamed in its shadow? What ceremonies unfolded along its coiled body? What prayers were spoken into its open mouth as the solstice sun descended? We do not know. The builders left no written records, no names, no explanations. Only the serpent itself, patient and silent, holding its secrets in curves of shaped earth. There is an oval shape near the serpent's head that has puzzled observers for generations. Some call it an egg, others say it represents the sun being swallowed. Still others believe it marks a burial site, though excavations have found no graves within the serpent's body, unlike other mounds in the region, which were clearly built to honor the dead. This absence is itself a mystery. If the serpent was not a tomb, what was it? A temple? A calendar? Map of something we cannot see? Some believe the serpent represents a constellation. Perhaps Draco, the dragon that coils around the celestial North Pole. Others see connections to myths found throughout the Americas. Stories of great serpents that carry the world on their backs, or guard the passage between life and death. The serpent appears in the traditions of countless cultures as a creator, destroyer, healer, guardian. Its form seems to speak to something deep in human consciousness, something older than any particular civilization. Perhaps the builders of this mound understood that. Perhaps they shaped the earth into a serpent, because the serpent was already sacred, a symbol that needed no explanation, that carried its meaning in its very form. Or perhaps we are projecting our own patterns onto something that meant something entirely different to those who made it. Perhaps the serpent held meanings we cannot imagine, rooted in a worldview that dissolved long before anyone thought to write it down. Beneath the silence, the mystery remains. The serpent has survived longer than it should have. When European settlers arrived in Ohio, they found hundreds of earthen mounds scattered across the landscape. Most were destroyed, ploughed under for farmland, leveled for roads, looted by treasure hunters who believed they might contain gold. The serpent nearly suffered the same fate. In the 19th century, the land was purchased by a Harvard professor who recognized its significance and worked to protect it. Later, it passed into the hands of preservation societies. Today, it is a state memorial, visited by thousands each year. But something has been lost that cannot be recovered. The context, the ceremonies, the people who once walked these curves and understood what they meant. The serpent survives, but the world that made it sacred has faded into the long silence of the past. And yet, stand at the serpent's head on a summer evening. As the sun descends toward the horizon, watch the light move across the land, touching each curve, each coil, each rise and fall of ancient earth. Feel the weight of all those vanished years, all those forgotten names, all those ceremonies that will never be performed again. Something remains, not knowledge exactly, not understanding, but presence. The sense that this place still holds what it was given, still guards what it was made to guard, still watches the sky with the same patience it has shown for 1,000 years. The night comes slowly to the Ohio hills. The serpent darkens by degrees, its curves dissolving into shadow. The first stars appear, perhaps the same stars the builders watched, the same lights they aligned their monument to receive. The creek below murmurs its endless song, carrying water that has flowed through this valley since long before humans arrived. What did they see, those ancient watchers? What did they hope for? What did they fear? We cannot know. The serpent keeps its silence, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some knowledge is not meant to be spoken, only felt. Perhaps some places exist not to answer our questions, but to remind us that questions themselves are sacred. That the deepest truths live not in explanations, but in the spaces where explanation fails. The serpent lies still upon its hill. Its mouth remains open, waiting for a sun that will return, as it always has, on the longest day. The coils mark their lunar alignments. The spiral tail curls inward, toward a center we cannot see, marked by the moon, shaped by hands that have returned to dust, holding a memory we can no longer rid. Perhaps, in the end, that is the message. Not what the serpent means, but that it means that someone, long ago, looked at this hill and saw something worth shaping, something worth preserving, something worth aligning with the patient movements of the sky. The land remembers, even when we forget. And the serpent waits, as it has always waited, for those who come with open eyes and quiet hearts, willing to stand in the presence of mystery without demanding that it speak. 4. Where the Maya counted the breath of Venus, there is a light that appears at dusk, brighter than any star, hanging low in the western sky as if reluctant to follow the sun into darkness. The ancients called it by many names, Hesperus in the evening, Phosphorus at dawn. But it was not a star at all. It was a wanderer, a planet. And to the Maya, who watched it from their jungle observatories for more than 1,000 years, it was something more still. It was a god, a messenger, a keeper of names so precise that its cycles govern the fates of kings and the blood of captives. Venus. The Maya called it Noek, the great star, and they understood its movements with an accuracy that would not be matched anywhere in the world for centuries to come. Deep in the Yucatan, where the jungle grows so thick that temples can vanish within a generation, there once stood cities whose towers were aligned not with earthly roads, but with the wandering path of this celestial light. Uxmal, Chichen Itza, Copan. Names that have survived when so much else has been lost. In these places, astronomer priests climbed stone platforms in the humid darkness, watching, recording, calculating, translating the breath of Venus into prophecies that would echo across an empire. It is said that the Maya did not merely observe the sky, they conversed with it. To understand what Venus meant to these watchers, we must first understand its strange behavior. Unlike the fixed stars which rise and set in predictable patterns year after year, Venus wanders. It appears in the western sky at dusk as the evening star, growing brighter night after night, until suddenly it disappears, sinking below the horizon, invisible for days or weeks. Then, just as mysteriously, it reappears in the east, rising before the sun as the morning star, beginning the cycle anew. This disappearance troubled ancient astronomers everywhere. Where did the bright wanderer go during its absence? What happened in those dark days when it could not be seen? The Maya had an answer. Venus descended into Xibalba, the underworld, a place of trials and terrors, ruled by death lords who delighted in tormenting those who passed through their realm. The planet's disappearance was not mere celestial mechanics. It was a journey through darkness, a confrontation with death itself. And when Venus emerged again on the opposite horizon, it was not the same star that had set. It was transformed, reborn, victorious over the lords of the underworld, at least for another cycle. This was not metaphor to the Maya. It was cosmic truth, written in light across the night sky, repeating every 584 days with a reliability that must have seemed like proof of divine order. And the Maya calculated this cycle with extraordinary precision. Their figure for the synodic period of Venus, the time between successive appearances as the evening star, was accurate to within 2 hours over 5 centuries. They predicted its movements so precisely that their tables, created more than 1,000 years ago, can still be verified against modern astronomical data. The sky, to them, was not random. It was a book written in light, and they had learned to read it. But the knowledge came with weight, with responsibility, with blood. Venus, for all its beauty, was not a gentle god. The Maya associated its heliacal rising, its first appearance as the morning star after the period of invisibility, with war, conquest, and sacrifice. The light that emerged from the underworld carried the energy of that passage, an energy that demanded release. Whispers tell us that kings planned their battles around Venus. They would wait, sometimes for months, until the planet emerged at the proper moment. And then they would strike. Captives taken in these Venus-blessed wars were not ordinary prisoners. They were offerings. Their blood was required to honor the god who had risen victorious from the underworld, to ensure that the cosmic cycles would continue. This is the darker current that runs beneath the Maya achievement. Their astronomical precision was not merely intellectual curiosity. It was theology made practical. The movements of Venus determined when men would fight, when captives would die, when kings would be crowned. The sky was not separate from human affairs. It was intertwined with them, each influencing the other in an endless dance of light and shadow. We cannot look away from this. The beauty of their calculations cannot be separated from the blood that those calculations sometimes demanded. To understand the Maya astronomers is to understand that the universe they inhabited was not neutral. It was alive with the forces that required acknowledgement, appeasement, participation. The stars watched, and sometimes what they watched for was sacrifice. In the year 1562, a Spanish bishop named Diego de Landa ordered the destruction of Maya books. Thousands of codices, bark paper manuscripts containing centuries of accumulated knowledge, were gathered and burned in a single day. Astronomy, history, mythology, medicine, all of it consigned to flames in the name of a god who had no patience for competing cosmologies. The Maya elders who witnessed this burning wept. They understood what was being lost. An entire civilization's conversation with the heavens, reduced to ash. Only 4 codices survived. 4 out of thousands. Among them is the Dresden Codex, named for the German city where it eventually came to rest. Its pages, painted on bark paper that has somehow endured for 8 centuries, contain the most complete record of Maya Venus observations that we possess. Tables of numbers, columns of glyphs, predictions stretching centuries into the future, all of it preserved by accident. By the chance that this particular book was sent to Europe as a curiosity before the burnings began. Modern astronomers have studied these tables with something approaching reverence. The calculations are not approximate, they are precise. The Maya tracked Venus through 5 complete cycles, correcting for small errors that accumulated over time, developing mathematical techniques that would not appear in European astronomy for hundreds of years. What else was lost in those flames? What other knowledge burned in the courtyards of Mani, while the elders wept and the soldiers watched? We cannot know. The silence where those books once existed is perhaps the deepest mystery of all. Visit Chichen Itza today and you will find the caracol, the observatory, named for the spiral staircase that winds through its interior. The windows of this tower are aligned not with the cardinal directions, but with the extreme positions of Venus on the horizon. Through these narrow slits, astronomers watched for the first glimmer of the morning star, recording its position, calculating its return. The tower is partially ruined now. Jungle has been cleared from around it, but the stones are weathered, the alignments difficult to trace. Tourists photograph it and move on to the Great Pyramid, never knowing that this modest structure was once a gateway between worlds, a place where human eyes met celestial light, where the breath of Venus was counted and recorded and transformed into prophecy. What did they feel, those astronomer priests, when the planet finally appeared? We cannot know for certain. Relief, perhaps, that the cycles continued. Terror, perhaps, at what the rising demanded. Or something we have no word for. A mix of awe and dread and participation that belonged only to those who believed the sky was not indifferent. That it watched, that it waited, that it required something of those who watched back. The jungle has its own patience. Given time, it reclaims everything. Temples that once gleamed white in the tropical sun are swallowed by roots. Observation slits fill with debris. The precise alignments shift. Stones settle and walls collapse. The stars continue their ancient patterns. But there is no one left who remembers what they mean. And yet the knowledge has not entirely vanished. It lives in the surviving codices, in the inscriptions on stone monuments, in the work of scholars who have spent lifetimes piecing together what was almost lost. The Maya understanding of Venus has not been surpassed. It has been confirmed. Modern astronomy has verified what the astronomer priests knew, that the cycles are real, that the calculations are accurate, that the wanderer follows its path with the same precision it showed 1,000 years ago. Perhaps that is the final gift of the Maya astronomers. Not just knowledge, but proof that knowledge of this kind is possible. That human beings, watching the sky from jungle towers without telescopes or computers, could map the movements of a planet with an accuracy that still astonishes. The stars do not remember them. Venus rises and sets as it always has, indifferent to the prayers and sacrifices once offered in its name. But we remember, beneath the silence of the ruined towers, where the jungle waits to reclaim what remains. We carry the echo of their watching. The breath of Venus continues, and somewhere in the warm darkness of a tropical night, the great star rises once more, bright and terrible and beautiful, keeping faith with cycles that will outlast us all. 5. The towers of silence in Persia upon the high plateaus of ancient Iran, where the wind has carried the dust of empires for 3,000 years, there once burned fires that were never allowed to die. These were not ordinary flames. They were prayers made visible, offerings of light in a cosmos that the Persians understood as an eternal battlefield between brightness and shadow. And beside these sacred fires, in towers built upon the highest ground, there watched a brotherhood of priests whose name would echo through centuries until it became synonymous with mystery itself. The Magi, the watchers, the keepers of flame and star. It is said that when Greek travelers first encountered these priests, they were struck by the depth of their astronomical knowledge. The Magi could predict eclipses. They tracked the wandering planets across their complex paths. They divided the night sky into constellations and assigned to each a meaning, a destiny, a role in the cosmic drama that they believed was unfolding above them every night. But the Greeks understood only part of what they witnessed. For the Magi, astronomy was not separate from theology. The stars were not merely lights to be catalogued. They were soldiers in an ancient war, expressions of divine forces locked in a struggle that had begun before time and would continue until time itself reached its end. This is the world we enter now, a world where fire and starlight were twin expressions of the same sacred truth, where the turning of the celestial spheres foretold the fates of kings, where silence itself was a form of reverence. Let us begin at dusk. In that hour, when the desert mountains fade from gold to violet, and the first stars emerge like ancient eyes opening after a long sleep. Imagine the temple precinct at Persepolis, before Alexander's torches reduced it to ruin. The great columns rise toward a sky that is still pale with the memory of sunset. Below, in chambers that few were permitted to enter, the sacred fires burn in their bronze vessels, fires that have been kept alive for generations, fed with sandalwood and prayers, never allowed to touch impure fuel or unclean hands. The priests who tend these flames have prepared themselves through elaborate rituals of purification. They have bathed, they have prayed, they have covered their mouths with cloth so that their breath, which carries the moisture of the body, the contamination of the material world, might not pollute the sacred fire. For fire, in Zoroastrian theology, is the visible presence of Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, the source of all light and truth. And now, as darkness gathers, other priests climb to the observation platforms above. These are the astronomers, the readers of celestial omens, the translators of starlight into prophecy. They carry instruments we can only partially reconstruct: sighting tubes, graduated circles, water clocks for measuring the hours. They take their positions and begin their nightly vigil, watching for signs in the movements of planets, the flickering of stars, the slow wheel of constellations across the dome of heaven. What did they see? What did they believe they were witnessing? The Zoroastrian cosmos was not neutral. It was not a clockwork mechanism ticking through meaningless cycles. It was alive with purpose, a battleground where Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light and Wisdom, struggled against Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the source of lies and darkness and decay. This cosmic dualism shaped everything the Magi observed. The stars were not merely distant suns. They were warriors of light, stationed in the heavens to hold back the forces of darkness. The planets, which wandered against the fixed background of stars, were more ambiguous. Some were helpers of the light, others agents of chaos whose movements brought misfortune. The great task of the astronomer priests was to read this celestial warfare, to understand its patterns, to predict its outcomes. For the battles in heaven were not separate from events on earth, as above, so below. The triumph or defeat of celestial forces would be reflected in the rise and fall of empires, the health of kings, the fertility of the land. Whispers tell us that the Magi developed elaborate tables for tracking planetary positions, that they predicted conjunctions and oppositions centuries in advance, that they understood the precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble of the Earth's axis that shifts the position of the stars over thousands of years. Whether all of this is true, we cannot say with certainty. So much has been lost. When Alexander conquered Persia, libraries burned. When Arab armies swept across the plateau, centuries later, more was destroyed or scattered. The Zoroastrian communities that survived were pushed to the margins, their traditions preserved in fragments, their astronomical knowledge dispersing like smoke into the winds of history. And yet echoes remain. The word magic itself descends from Magi, those Persian priests, whose wisdom seemed so profound to Greek observers that their very name became synonymous with secret knowledge. The concepts they developed, the cosmic struggle between good and evil, the coming of a savior at the end of time, the resurrection of the dead, would flow into Judaism during the Babylonian exile, and from there into Christianity and Islam. And then there is the story that has carried the name of the Magi further than any other. In the Gospel of Matthew, wise men from the east follow a star to Bethlehem. They are called Magi in the original Greek, not kings as later tradition would name them, but those same astronomer priests of Persia whose order had watched the heavens for centuries. The story tells us they had seen a star rising, a celestial sign that announced the birth of a great king. And they traveled westward, following the light, carrying gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. What star was this? Scholars have proposed conjunctions of planets, the appearance of comets, the eclosion of distant supernovae. We cannot know for certain, but the story itself preserves something true about the Magi, their vigilance, their belief that the heavens spoke to those trained to listen, their willingness to journey across borders in pursuit of signs written in light. The Magi who visited Bethlehem, if they existed, would have seen that birth not as a break with their tradition, but as its fulfillment. For Zoroastrian prophecy spoke of saviors who would appear at crucial moments in cosmic history, turning the tide in the war between light and darkness. A star announcing such a birth would not have surprised them. It would have confirmed what they had always believed, that the sky was watching, that the struggle continued, that light would ultimately triumph. Visit the ruins of Persepolis today, and you will find columns standing against the empty sky, like the ribs of some vast creature that has fallen and will not rise again. The fires are gone. The observation platforms have crumbled. The wind carries dust across stones that once knew the footsteps of kings and priests. But look closely at the carvings that remain. Look at the winged figures, the stylized flames, the images of the Zoroastrian god that later traditions would transform into angels. Something of the Magi's vision is still encoded here, in stone that has outlasted the libraries, the scrolls, the whispered teachings that passed from master to student for generations. Their knowledge dispersed, as all knowledge eventually disperses. It flowed into Babylonian star catalogues that would later reach Greece. It shaped the astrology of the Hellenistic world, which would in turn influence Rome, Arabia, medieval Europe. Every time someone speaks of cosmic struggle between forces of light and darkness, every time a story places wise men following a star, the echo of the Magi sounds faintly beneath the words. The night comes to the Iranian plateau with a cold that surprises those unfamiliar with deserts. The same thin air that makes the stars burn so brightly carries away the heat of day with merciless efficiency. The Magi who watched from these heights knew this cold intimately. They wrapped themselves in robes and waited, patient as the stars themselves, for the signs they had trained their whole lives to read. What did they feel in those long hours between sunset and dawn? What passed through their minds as they watched the slow procession of constellations, knowing themselves to be witnesses to a war that had been waged since before the world began? We cannot know. The silence has claimed their voices along with their names. But perhaps in that very silence, something of their vigil continues. The stars they watched still burn in their ancient positions. The cosmic cycles they tracked still turn, indifferent to the empires that have risen and fallen beneath them. And somewhere in the darkness, in the space between firelight and starlight, between what is known and what can only be felt, the Magi's wisdom waits. Not as knowledge written in books, for those books are ashes now, but as echo, as presence, as the faint and sacred certainty that the light has not gone out, that the watchers are not entirely forgotten, that some truths survive even when the towers crumble and the flames are finally allowed to die. Beneath the silence, the vigil continues, marked by the moon, remembered by the stars, carried on the wind that has blown across these plateaus for 3,000 years, and will blow for 3,000 more, whispering secrets that only the patient can hear. 6. The stone circles of the forgotten, north in the grey hour before dawn, when the world has not yet decided whether to wake or return to dreaming. There are places where the veil between what is and what was grows thin as mist. These places do not announce themselves. They wait. They have been waiting for thousands of years, patient as stone, silent as the dead who may still rest beneath them. On a windswept ridge in the Outer Hebrides, where Scotland dissolves into the cold Atlantic, a circle of standing stones rises from the peat, like hooded figures frozen in the midst of some ancient ceremony. This is Callanish. The locals call the stones Fyr Berege, the false men, as if the stones were once people, transformed by enchantment into pillars of Lewisianes. A rock so old it was formed before complex life existed on Earth. The stones have stood here for nearly 5,000 years, longer than the pyramids, longer than Stonehenge, longer than any written word in any language still spoken. And still they wait, arranged in patterns that align with events in the sky that most of us have forgotten to notice. It is said that the moon, at its most extreme rising point, a phenomenon that occurs only once every 18 years, threads between these pillars in a dance of light and shadow. Those who built Callanish understood this cycle. They planned for it. They shaped their monument around a celestial event that none of them would live to see more than 4 or 5 times in an entire lifetime. What patience this required. What faith in something larger than a single human span, beyond the boundaries of Rome's crumbling influence. In lands the legions never fully conquered, the ancient peoples of the north raised monuments that still defy easy explanation. From the rain-soaked hills of Ireland to the windswept coasts of Brittany, from the Scottish Islands to the chalk downs of southern England, stone circles and standing stones mark the landscape like scattered seeds from some forgotten harvest. They built without metal tools. They left no written records. We do not know what they called themselves, what language they spoke, what gods they honored. All we have are the stones themselves, and the alignments those stones preserve, pointing toward horizons where certain stars rose and set, where the sun reached its extreme positions, where the moon performed its slow and complex dance across the sky. These were not random placements. Archaeoastronomers have studied these sites for decades, mapping their orientations, measuring their sight lines. Again and again, the alignments prove intentional. The builders understood the movements of celestial bodies with a precision that seems impossible for people we once dismissed as primitive. But perhaps that word, primitive, reveals more about our ignorance than theirs. Whispers tell us that these monuments were the work of many generations. A stone circle was not raised in a single effort, but accumulated over centuries, each generation adding to what their ancestors had begun, each understanding themselves as links in a chain that stretched backward into myth and forward into futures they would never see. This is a kind of thinking we have largely lost. We build for ourselves, for our lifetimes, perhaps for our children. They built for the ages. They built for the moon cycle that would complete itself long after their grandchildren's grandchildren had returned to the earth. Let us wander now through these sacred landscapes, these forgotten norths, where the stones still keep their vigil. In Brittany, at Carnac, more than 3,000 standing stones march across the countryside in parallel rows that stretch for miles. No one knows why. The alignments are astronomical. Some point towards solstice sunrises, others toward the extreme positions of the moon. But the sheer scale of the monument suggests something more than practical observation. This was a statement, a declaration, a marking of the earth so profound that the land itself would never forget. On the Orkney Islands, where the wind rarely rests and the sea is visible from every rise of ground, there stands the Ring of Brodgar, a perfect circle of stones set on a narrow isthmus between two lochs. 27 stones remain of what may once have been 60, their surfaces weathered by 5,000 years of rain and salt spray. The circle is surrounded by a ditch carved into solid bedrock, a labour so immense that archaeologists estimate it required 80,000 hours of work with tools of antler and bone. Why? What moved these people to such efforts? We can only approach the question with humility. Our categories, observatory, temple, cemetery, gathering place, may not apply. Perhaps these circles were all of these at once, and something more besides. Perhaps they were places where the boundary between earth and sky dissolved, where the movements of celestial bodies could be enacted and embodied, where humans participated in cosmic cycles rather than merely observing them. The vocabulary here must feel like moss and rain. Words like standing, waiting, threshold, passage, belonging. Return now to Ireland, to a bend in the River Boyne, where a great mound rises from the winter fields. This is Newgrange, older than the pyramids of Giza, older than Stonehenge, one of the most remarkable structures ever built by human hands. The mound is massive, covering more than an acre, ringed with white quartz stones that would have gleamed in the ancient sun like a beacon visible for miles. But the true wonder lies within. A narrow passage, 60 feet long, leads into the heart of the mound, ending in a chamber shaped like a cross, its ceiling corbelled into a vault that has kept the interior dry for 5,000 years. And once each year, at the winter solstice, something miraculous happens. Above the entrance to the passage, there is a small opening, a roof box, carefully constructed, precisely angled. As the sun rises on the shortest day of the year, a beam of light enters through this opening and travels slowly down the passage. Minute by minute, the light advances until it reaches the inner chamber and illuminates the carved stones at the back wall. For approximately 17 minutes, the chamber fills with golden light. Then the sun rises higher, the angle changes, and the darkness returns. This alignment was not accidental. The builders of Newgrange understood the solstice with perfect precision. They constructed their monument to capture a moment that happens only once each year. A moment that has repeated faithfully for 50 centuries and will continue repeating for centuries to come, as long as the stones endure and the earth continues its ancient dance around the sun. What did they feel, those ancient people, when the light entered the chamber? Were the ashes of their honored dead placed within, awaiting this annual resurrection? Did the living gather outside, watching, waiting, praying for the light to return as it always had, as it always would? We cannot know, but something in us responds to the image. Something in us understands the longing for light in the darkest time of year. The hope that the sun will return, that the cycle will continue, that we are not abandoned in the cold and darkness. The twilight comes early in these northern lands. The stones darken by degrees, their shadows lengthening across the peat and heather. The wind carries the smell of rain from the sea. And in that grey hour between day and night, the monuments seem to wake, not into movement, but into a deeper stillness, a presence that can only be felt when the noise of the modern world fades away. These circles were not built for us. They were built for people whose names we will never know, whose languages have dissolved into silence, whose beliefs we can only guess at from the arrangements of stone they left behind. And yet the stones still stand. The alignments still work. The solstice light still enters the chamber at Newgrange, as it has entered for 5,000 winters, asking nothing, offering nothing except the simple proof that some things endure. Beneath the silence, something remains. Not knowledge exactly, not even memory, but something older than both, a sense of connection to those who came before, who looked at the same stars, who waited for the same returning light, who understood that their lives were brief, but the patterns they traced in stone might last forever. The builders have returned to the earth. Their ceremonies have ended. Their voices have faded into the wind that blows across these sacred hills. But the stones still wait, still watch, still mark the slow turnings of the sky above their cold and sacred lands. And perhaps on certain nights, when the moon rises at its most extreme point, when the mist lifts from the peat bogs and the stars burn cold and clear, perhaps then, for those who have learned patience, who have learned humility, who have learned to listen to the silence, the stones still speak. We have only to remember how to hear it. 7. The lost observatory of Ulugh Beg, in the ancient city of Samarkand, where the Silk Road once carried spices and silk and whispered secrets between empires, there lived a prince who cared nothing for conquest. While other rulers dreamed of expanding their territories, of armies and victories and the submission of rivals, this prince dreamed only of the stars. He spent his nights not in feasting halls but on observation platforms, watching the slow wheel of constellations, measuring the positions of celestial bodies with a precision that would not be surpassed for 200 years. His name was Ulugh Beg, and the observatory he built upon a hill outside Samarkand would become, for a brief and brilliant moment, the most accurate astronomical instrument the world had ever known. It is said that some souls are born looking upward, drawn to the heavens by a longing they cannot explain. Ulugh Beg was such a soul. He was the grandson of Timur the Great. Tamerlane, the conqueror who had built pyramids of skulls and left cities burning in his wake. But the grandson inherited none of his grandfather's thirst for blood. He inherited instead a different kind of hunger, for knowledge, for precision, for the patient work of understanding what moved in the night sky, and why. In the year 1420, when Ulugh Beg was 36 years old, and the ruler of a vast but troubled empire, he began construction of an observatory that would consume his passion for the rest of his life. And in that observatory, he and his astronomers would chart the heavens with an accuracy that still astonishes those who study their work today. Let us descend now into the archive where the work began. Imagine a long room lit by oil lamps, their flames steady in the still air. Scholars sit at wooden tables covered with manuscripts. Greek treatises translated into Arabic, Persian star catalogues refined over centuries, Indian astronomical texts carrying knowledge from traditions even older. The accumulated wisdom of 3 civilizations lies spread across these surfaces, waiting to be synthesized, corrected, surpassed. Ulugh Beg himself often worked among these scholars. He was not a dilettante prince dabbling in astronomy for amusement. He was a serious mathematician, capable of making his own calculations, of catching errors in the work of others. The scholars who gathered at Samarkand were among the finest minds of the age. Men like Jamshed al-Kashe, whose mathematical innovations would influence science for centuries, and Qadizada al-Rumi, whose commentary on ancient texts opened new pathways of understanding. Together, they undertook a project of extraordinary ambition: to observe and catalogue the positions of over 1,000 stars with a precision that would render all previous catalogues obsolete. Not approximately, not close enough, but with an accuracy measured in fractions of degrees, pushing the limits of what could be achieved with the instruments of their time. To accomplish this, they would need something unprecedented. They would need an instrument so large, so precisely constructed, that even the smallest measurements could be trusted. They would need the great sextant of Samarkand. Carved into the hillside behind the observatory, the sextant was a curved trench, nearly 60 meters long. A colossal arc of stone and marble, descending into the earth at a precise angle. Along its length, graduated markings allowed astronomers to measure the altitude of celestial bodies as they crossed the meridian, tracking their positions night after night, season after season, year after year. The scale of this instrument is difficult to grasp. Imagine a curved corridor of polished stone, wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, plunging down into the earth at an angle of 45 degrees. At the bottom, the arc continues underground, protected from the elements. Along the walls, calibration marks divide the degrees into minutes and the minutes into seconds, achieving a precision of approximately 1/60th of a degree, an accuracy that European astronomers would not match until the invention of the telescope nearly 2 centuries later. Here, on clear nights when the stars burned bright above the Central Asian plateau, Ulugh Beg and his astronomers took their measurements. They tracked the sun through its annual cycle, determining the length of the year to within seconds of the modern value. They measured the obliquity of the ecliptic, the tilt of the Earth's axis, with an accuracy that would stand as the best determination for hundreds of years. They catalogued star after star, recording positions so precise that modern astronomers have verified their work and found it remarkably accurate. The sage, the astronomical tables, that emerged from this observatory would be translated into Latin and carried to Europe, where they would guide navigators and astronomers long after the observatory itself had fallen to ruin. Whispers tell us that Ulugh Beg often spent entire nights on the observation platform, leaving the administration of his empire to ministers and advisors. He was not neglecting his duties, as his critics claimed. He was performing what he understood to be the highest duty of all: reading the book of the heavens, deciphering the patterns that God had written in light across the infinite ceiling of the cosmos. But empires do not forgive rulers who prefer stars to statecraft. While Ulugh Beg watched the heavens, his realm grew unstable. Rivals gathered power. His own sons became instruments of factions that saw the astronomer prince as an obstacle to their ambitions. The religious establishment, which had always viewed the observatory with suspicion, whimpered that such detailed study of the stars bordered on impiety, that only God should know the movements of the heavens, and that human attempts to chart them were a form of forbidden knowledge. In the year 1449, Ulugh Beg's own son, Abd al-Latif, led a rebellion against his father. The astronomer prince was captured, dethroned, and sentenced to make a pilgrimage to Mecca in atonement for his sins. He never arrived. On the road outside Samarkand, he was murdered by the assassins sent by his son. Abd al-Latif himself would rule for barely a year before being murdered in turn. But before his own death, he ordered the destruction of his father's observatory. Stone by stone, the buildings were dismantled. The instruments were broken. The great sextant was abandoned, left to fill with dust and debris, its precise calibrations obscured by rubble and neglect. Within a generation, the location of the observatory was forgotten entirely. The greatest astronomical instrument of the medieval world vanished from memory, known only through the manuscripts that had already scattered across the world. Translated, copied, carried to distant libraries, where they would wait for future scholars to rediscover them. For nearly 500 years, the observatory existed only in texts. European astronomers used Ulugh Beg's star tables without knowing what had happened to the place where they were created. The precision of the measurements was evident. The fate of the measurers was not. The name Ulugh Beg appeared in astronomical treatises, but the story of his life and death, his devotion and his murder, faded into the silence of history. Then, in 1908, a Russian archaeologist named Vasily Vyatkin began searching for the lost observatory. Using clues from medieval manuscripts, he traced its probable location to a hill outside Samarkand. And there, beneath centuries of accumulated soil, he found the curved trench of the great sextant, still descending into the earth, still bearing its calibration marks, still pointing toward the heavens it had been built to measure. The excavation revealed only a fraction of what had once existed. The observation platforms are gone. The archive where scholars bent over oil-lit manuscripts has vanished without trace. The instruments that measured the sun and planets have been scattered to dust. But the sextant remains. That great curved trench, carved into the hillside by a prince who loved the stars more than power, still marks the meridian of Samarkand, still points toward the celestial equator, still testifies to a precision that the ancient world achieved only here in this place, for this brief and brilliant moment. Visit the site today and you will find a museum, a monument, a place where tourists photograph the curved trench and read plaques explaining what was lost. The stars that Ulugh Beg charted still burn in their ancient positions, indifferent to the fate of those who measured them. The constellations still wheel overhead as they did 6 centuries ago, when a prince stood on this hillside and devoted his life to understanding their movements. What remains of his work? The manuscripts that escaped the destruction, copied, translated, preserved in libraries from Istanbul to Oxford. The star tables that guided navigators across oceans Ulugh Beg never knew existed. The name that survived when everything else was erased. And perhaps something more. Perhaps something that cannot be measured in degrees and minutes. A testament to what human devotion can achieve, and what human violence can destroy. Beneath the silence of that Uzbek hillside, the ghost of precision still lingers. The curved trench still descends into darkness, still carries its calibrations, still remembers the measurements that were taken here before the suns turned against the fathers and the stones were torn down. The stars do not mourn. They burn on, as they always have, as they always will. But we who remember, we who stand where the great sextant once measured the heavens with unmatched accuracy, we carry the weight of all that was lost when the observatory fell. Some knowledge is not meant to be forbidden. Some devotion is not impiety. Perhaps, in the end, the stars remember what we forget. 8. The breath of the Pleiades at Teotihuacan. There is a city in the Valley of Mexico that no one remembers building. Its pyramids rise from the highland plain like mountains shaped by intention. Their angles precise, their alignments deliberate, their purpose dissolved into a silence that has lasted more than 1,000 years. We do not know what its founders called it. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what gods they honored or what prayers they lifted toward the sky. We know only that when the Aztecs arrived centuries after the city had fallen into abandonment, they found it already ancient, already holy, already wrapped in a mystery so profound that they gave it a name of reverence and fear. Teotihuacan, the place where men become gods. What happened here, in this valley, beneath the clear mountain sky? What transformation was sought? What transcendence attempted? What covenant struck between earth and heaven? The stones do not answer, but they remember. And if we walk the avenue of the dead at twilight, when the first stars emerge over the pyramid of the sun, we may begin to feel the shape of what was lost, not as knowledge, but as presence, as breath, as the faint echo of ceremonies that have not been performed for 1,500 years. Let us begin with the stars themselves. In the soft darkness before true night, when the western sky still holds the memory of sunset, there appears a cluster of lights so distinctive that nearly every culture on earth has given it a name. The Greeks called them the Pleiades, the seven sisters, daughters of Atlas, transformed into stars to escape the pursuit of Orion. The Japanese call them Subaru. The Maori of New Zealand call them Matariki. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have watched them for tens of thousands of years, weaving them into stories of creation and loss. And here, in the Valley of Mexico, the builders of Teotihuacan align their greatest monuments not with the cardinal directions, not with north, south, east, or west, but with the setting point of these soft blue stars. The alignment is not approximate. It is precise. The entire grid of the city, the avenue of the dead, the pyramid of the sun, the pyramid of the moon is rotated 15.5 degrees east of true north, pointing toward the place on the horizon where the Pleiades descend each night during certain seasons. The street of the dead itself, that great ceremonial avenue, stretching for miles through the heart of the city, was laid out to align with this stellar setting. Why? Wizards tell us that the Pleiades held a special significance in Mesoamerican thought. Their heliacal rising, their first appearance in the eastern sky before dawn, marked the beginning of the agricultural calendar. Their disappearance into the sun's glare signaled the time to prepare the fields. Their return announced the season of planting. These soft blue stars, distant beyond all comprehension, governed the rhythms of seed and harvest, of hunger and plenty, of life itself. But there was more. Every 52 years, when the Mesoamerican calendar cycles aligned, the Pleiades reached the zenith, the very top of the sky at midnight. This was the most sacred moment in the ancient calendar, the hinge upon which ages turned. On this night, all fires were extinguished throughout the land. Darkness fell complete. And when the Pleiades passed safely through the zenith, when the cosmic gears meshed and the universe continued, new fire was kindled on a prisoner's chest, and the flames were carried to every hearth, every temple, every corner of the world. The breath of the Pleiades, the renewal of time itself. Walk now along the avenue of the dead. in that blue hour when the pyramids become silhouettes against the fading sky. The avenue stretches before you, not a street in any modern sense, but a ceremonial way, a processional path, a river of stone 2 miles long and 40 meters wide. The name itself is misleading. Avenue of the Dead was given by the Aztecs, who believed the mounds along its length were tombs of ancient kings. They were not tombs. They were platforms, temples, stages for rituals we can no longer reconstruct. At the northern end rises the Pyramid of the Munke, its form echoing the mountain that looms behind it. Cerro Gordo, the fat mountain, whose shape the pyramid deliberately mirrors. The alignment is exact. Standing at the base of the pyramid and looking north, the natural mountain and the artificial mountain merge into a single sacred form, as if the builders were completing what nature had begun. At the heart of the avenue stands the Pyramid of the Sun, third largest pyramid in the world, its base nearly as wide as the Great Pyramid of Giza. Beneath its foundations, archaeologists discovered a cave, a natural cavern that extends eastward in the shape of a 4-petaled flower. Some believe this cave was the original reason for the city's location, a place where the underworld opened into the world of the living, a womb from which creation emerged. The pyramid above was built to mark this sacred opening, to honor it, to transform it into a gateway between realms. The astronomical alignments woven into Teotihuacan go far beyond the Pleiades. Certain temples mark the rising of Sirius, brightest of all stars. Others align with the solstices, capturing the extreme positions of the sun on the longest and shortest days. Still others track the wandering path of Venus, that brilliant wanderer whose cycles governed war and sacrifice throughout Mesoamerica. The entire city was a calendar written in stone, a cosmology made visible, a map of the heavens pressed into the earth so that those who walked its streets would walk through sacred time, through the cycles of celestial bodies whose movements governed planting and warfare and the fate of kings. And yet we cannot read this calendar with certainty. The builders left no written records that we have decoded. Their language, if they had one that was written, has not survived. We reconstruct their astronomy from alignments and artifacts, from the testimony of later peoples who inherited fragments of their knowledge, from the silent testimony of the stones themselves. Beneath the silence, something waits, not answers, but questions, not certainty, but the profound humility of standing before mysteries that may never be solved. Who were the builders of Teotihuacan? At its height, around the year 450 of the Common Era, the city held perhaps 100,000 people, one of the largest cities in the world at that time. They came from across Mesoamerica, drawn to this sacred center for reasons we can only imagine. The city was cosmopolitan, diverse, organized into neighborhoods that seemed to have housed people from different regions and ethnic backgrounds. They produced art of extraordinary sophistication. They traded with civilizations hundreds of miles away. They maintained their city for nearly 7 centuries, generation after generation, adding to and reshaping what their ancestors had built. And then, around the year 550, something happened. The city burned, not from outside invasion, it seems, but from within. The temples along the Avenue of the Dead were systematically destroyed, their images defaced, their sacred objects smashed, the population dispersed. Within a generation, Teotihuacan had become a ghost city. its pyramids standing empty beneath the highland sky. What catastrophe brought this end? What crisis of faith, or politics, or ecology drove the people to destroy their own sacred center? We do not know. The silence that followed has lasted 1,500 years. The sun sets now over the Valley of Mexico. The pyramids darken against the western sky, their angles softening in the failing light. The tourists have departed. The vendors have packed their wares. And in the east, just above the horizon, the first stars begin to appear. There, low in the sky, soft and blue, clustered like a breath of light, the Pleiades emerge. The same stars that the builders of Teotihuacan aligned their city to honor. The same stars that mark the planting seasons, the turning of ages, the renewal of sacred fire. They rise as they have risen for millennia, indifferent to the civilizations that have watched them, patient as only stars can be. The alignment holds. After 2,000 years, the Avenue of the Dead still points toward the setting of the Seven Sisters. The pyramids still mirror the mountains. The cave beneath the pyramids of the sun still opens toward the east, still waits in darkness for light that no longer comes. The builders are gone. Their names have dissolved into silence. Their ceremonies have ended. Their prayers have faded into the thin mountain air. But the breath of the Pleiades continues. The stars still rise and set in their ancient patterns, still mark the seasons, still wheel through the sky above the empty avenues and silent temples. And perhaps, on certain nights, when the air is clear and the stars burn bright and the modern world falls away, perhaps then, standing among the pyramids, one can feel what the builders felt. The presence of something vast, the weight of time, the sacred geometry of a city built not for the living alone, but for the stars, and for whatever transformation was sought in the space between earth and heaven, the place where men become gods, or perhaps where gods once descended and left only stones to remember them by. 9. The cathedral astronomers and their hidden lines at noon on the summer solstice in the great basilica of San Petronio in Bologna. Something happens that most visitors never notice. A beam of sunlight enters through a small hole high in the cathedral wall, an aperture no larger than a coin, and falls upon the marble floor far below. There, embedded in the stone, a thin line of brass stretches across the nave, marked with calibrations that most passers-by take for decoration. But this is no decoration. This is a meridiana, a solar instrument of extraordinary precision, hidden in plain sight within the house of God. And for those who know what they are witnessing, the beam of light striking that brass line is a moment of celestial revelation, a conjunction of the sacred and the scientific that has been repeating faithfully for more than 300 years. It is said that astronomy nearly perished in the West after Rome fell. The observatories crumbled. The scrolls were scattered. The knowledge that had been gathered over centuries dissolved into the chaos of collapsing empires and warring kingdoms. But some flames, once kindled, refused to die entirely. And in the dim interiors of medieval cathedrals, far from the ruined temples of antiquity, the ancient practice of watching the sky found a new and secret home. This is the story of the cathedral astronomers, those patient souls who measured the heavens not from mountaintops, but from church floors, not with great instruments exposed to the stars, but with beams of light falling through carefully positioned holes in sacred walls. To understand why astronomy survived in cathedrals, we must first understand a problem that consumed the medieval church: the calculation of Easter. Easter, the most important feast in the Christian calendar, does not fall on a fixed date. It is determined by the moon. Specifically, it occurs on the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox. This seemingly simple rule conceals enormous complexity. To calculate Easter accurately, one must know precisely when the equinox falls. One must understand the cycles of the moon. One must reconcile the solar year with the lunar month, accounting for the slow drift between calendars and celestial reality. The Julian calendar, inherited from Rome, was imperfect. It assumed a year of exactly 365.25 days, but the true solar year is slightly shorter. Over centuries, this small error accumulated. The equinox, which the calendar placed on March 21st, began to drift earlier and earlier through the actual seasons. By the 16th century, the calendar was 10 days out of alignment with the heavens. This was not merely an astronomical curiosity. It was a theological crisis. If the Church could not accurately determine the equinox, it could not accurately calculate Easter. And if Easter was celebrated on the wrong day, the most sacred mystery of Christianity was being honored at the wrong moment, a thought that troubled popes and scholars alike. The solution required precise observation of the sun. And so, with papal blessing and ecclesiastical funding, astronomers began transforming churches into observatories. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. High in a cathedral wall or dome, a small aperture was opened, carefully positioned and precisely measured. When the sun crossed the meridian at local noon, its light would enter through this hole and project a bright disk onto the floor below. The height of the aperture and the distance to the floor created a kind of pinhole camera, projecting an image of the sun that moved across the nave as the seasons changed. A brass line was embedded in the floor, running exactly north to south, marked with careful gradations. As the months passed, the sun's image would travel along this line, striking far to the south at the winter solstice, when the sun rides low in the sky, and moving northward toward the aperture as summer approached and the sun climbed higher. By measuring exactly where the sun's image fell on the meridian line, astronomers could determine the sun's altitude with remarkable precision. And from these measurements, they could calculate the exact moment of the equinox, the day when the sun crossed the celestial equator, when day and night stood equal, when Easter could be properly reckoned. The longer the meridian line, the more precise the measurements could be. And so the cathedral astronomers sought the largest churches they could find, transforming the vast naves of Gothic cathedrals into scientific instruments of unprecedented accuracy. In Bologna, the great meridian of San Petronio stretches 67 meters across the cathedral floor, the longest indoor meridian line in the world. It was constructed in 1655 by Giovanni Domenico Cassini, who would later become famous for his observations of Saturn's rings and the gap that still bears his name. Cassini understood that the existing calendrical observations were insufficient. He needed data of extraordinary precision to determine whether the Church's calendar reform of 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII had excised 10 days from October to bring the calendar back into alignment, had been calculated correctly. The meridian of San Petronio would provide that data. The construction was painstaking. The aperture in the wall was positioned at a height of precisely 27,007 meters. The brass line on the floor was leveled with obsessive care, embedded in marble slabs that would not shift or settle over time. Calibration marks were added, converting the sun's position into degrees and minutes of arc. When completed, the instrument could measure the sun's altitude to within a few seconds of arc, a precision that would not be exceeded by any other solar observatory for over a century. Whispers tell us that Cassini spent countless hours in the dim cathedral, waiting for the moment of noon, watching the golden disk of projected sunlight creep across the floor toward the brass line. In those moments, the sacred space became a laboratory. The house of God became a temple to measurement. And the light that streamed through the aperture carried not just illumination, but information. Data that would reshape humanity's understanding of time itself. San Petronio was not alone. In Florence, the great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, Brunelleschi's masterpiece, was fitted with a bronze plate containing a small aperture. The gnomon of the Florence Cathedral, installed in 1475, projected the sun's image onto the floor of the lantern during the summer solstice, allowing astronomers to track changes in the sun's altitude over years and decades. In Paris, a meridian line was installed in the Church of Saint-Sulpice in 1727. A brass strip runs across the floor of the transept, climbing up the white marble obelisk at the north end. On the winter solstice, the sun's image strikes a golden disk at the top of the obelisk. On the equinoxes, it touches a copper plate embedded in the floor. The instrument still functions today, still marking the same celestial moments it was built to measure nearly 3 centuries ago. In Rome, in Palermo, in churches throughout Europe, similar instruments were constructed. Each one a collaboration between ecclesiastical authority and astronomical inquiry. Each one disguising the pursuit of celestial knowledge as the calculation of liturgical necessity. The vocabulary here must carry words like shadow and calculation, secret and patience. For these astronomers walked a careful line. The church that funded their work had also condemned Galileo. The institution that needed their measurements to calculate Easter was suspicious of the cosmological implications those measurements might reveal. The cathedral astronomers pursued their science under the cover of religious necessity, transforming houses of worship into observatories while carefully avoiding the questions that might bring them into conflict with theological authority. Stand now in San Petronio as the noon hour approaches. The cathedral is dim, lit only by candles and the pale glow filtering through stained glass. The air is cool, heavy with centuries of incense and prayer. Tourists wander among the chapels, their footsteps echoing in the vast nave. Most of them walk across the brass line without noticing it, their eyes drawn upward toward the vaulted ceiling, the painted walls, the artifacts of conventional devotion. And then, if the day is clear and the hour is right, the light begins. A bright disk appears on the floor, the projected image of the sun itself, entering through that small aperture high in the southern wall. It moves slowly, almost imperceptibly, tracking across the marble as the earth turns and the sun crosses the meridian. For a few minutes, the image touches the brass line, and those who know what they are watching can read the sun's position in the calibration marks worn smooth by centuries of passage. Then the moment passes. The light moves on, fading as the sun continues its arc. The cathedral returns to its perpetual twilight, its shadows, its silence. But the line remains. The aperture still opens to the sky. And on the next clear day, at the next noon hour, the beam will return, and the measurement will be taken again, as it has been taken for more than 300 years. The calendar reform that these instruments helped verify is still in use today. The Gregorian calendar, adjusted by the observations of cathedral astronomers like Cassini, governs the rhythms of modern life, our months and seasons, our holidays and anniversaries, our shared understanding of where we stand in the turning of the year. Most of us never think about this. We take for granted that the calendar aligns with the heavens, that the solstices and equinoxes fall when they should, that the machinery of timekeeping operates without error. But in the dim naves of certain European churches, the evidence of that labor remains. The brass lines still cross the marble floors. The apertures still open to the sun. And for those who know where to look, the ancient instruments still function, still marking the solstices and equinoxes, still tracing the sun's path through the seasons, still bearing witness to a time when the sacred and the scientific were not separate domains, but twin expressions of a single devotion. Beneath the silence of the cathedral, the light keeps its vigil. Some secrets hide not in darkness, but in plain sight, waiting for those who remember how to see. 10. The Invisible College and the Heresy of Heliocentrism in a Darkened Study in Florence. In the year 1633, an old man knelt before the assembled cardinals of the Inquisition and spoke words that tasted of ash in his mouth. He recanted. He denied what he knew to be true. He declared that the earth stood still at the center of all things, that the sun moved around it as Scripture taught, that he had been wrong, grievously, heretically wrong, to suggest otherwise. Galileo Galilei was 70 years old. He had seen the moons of Jupiter through his telescope, watched Venus pass through phases that proved it circled the sun, observed the heavens with eyes that no human being before him had possessed. And now he knelt and lied, because the alternative was imprisonment, torture, perhaps death. It is said that as he rose from his knees, he muttered under his breath, "Eppur si muove." And yet it moves. Whether he truly spoke those words, we cannot know. But the sentiment lived on in the hearts of those who came after. Those who knew the earth moved, who had seen the evidence with their own eyes, who understood that the universe was vastly larger and stranger than the Church permitted them to say. In the decades following Galileo's trial, these men formed invisible networks, passing dangerous knowledge through coded letters and secret meetings, preserving truth against the day when it might finally be safe to speak aloud. This is their story, a story not of triumph, but of patience, not of declarations, but of whispers. A candle passed from hand to hand through a long and enforced darkness. The danger was real. We sometimes imagine the conflict between science and religious authority as a matter of intellectual debate. Scholars arguing in comfortable studies, the worst consequence being academic disapproval. But in 17th century Europe, the stakes were far higher. The Inquisition had the power to imprison, to torture, to execute. Books could be burned. Careers could be destroyed. Lives could end on the scaffold or in the flames. Giordano Bruno had been burned at the stake in 1600 for teaching, among other heresies, that the stars were distant suns with their own planets. Galileo escaped with house arrest only because of his fame and his connections. Lesser scholars enjoyed no such protection. To speak openly of a moving earth was to risk everything. And yet the observations continued. The truth, once seen, could not be unseen. Across Europe, in studies and observatories, in the private chambers of nobles sympathetic to the new philosophy, men pointed their telescopes at the sky and recorded what they witnessed. They saw the phases of Venus proving it orbited the Sun. They tracked the moons of Jupiter as they circled their giant master. They measured the parallax of stars and calculated distances that made the Earth seem very small indeed. But they did not publish. They did not proclaim. They wrote in code, shared in secret, and waited. The networks that preserved this knowledge were informal, shifting, sustained by trust and correspondence rather than official charters or public meetings. Whispers tell us of the invisible college, a phrase used by natural philosophers in England to describe their loose association of like-minded investigators. They met in private homes, in Oxford and London, sharing experiments and observations that could not yet be spoken in public forums. They wrote to each other using symbols and circumlocutions, disguising celestial bodies under invented names, concealing the true subjects of their inquiry from anyone who might intercept their letters. In Italy, the Accademia del Cimento, the Academy of Experiment, gathered in Florence under the protection of the Medici. For a brief decade, from 1657 to 1667, they conducted investigations into physics and astronomy, publishing their findings with careful attention to what could and could not be said. When pressure from Rome grew too great, the Academy quietly dissolved, its members scattering, its work unfinished, but not forgotten. In France, astronomers corresponded with colleagues across Europe, sharing observations of eclipses, comets, planetary motions. They used the mail services that connected the continent's scholars, knowing that their letters might be opened, read, reported. They learned to write in ways that concealed as much as they revealed, trusting that the initiated would understand what the censors would not. The vocabulary of these exchanges carries words like concealment and patience, risk and trust. These were not heroic declarations of defiance. They were the careful, quiet persistence of those who valued truth more than safety, but understood that truth preserved in silence might yet outlive truth that died in flames. Consider the astronomers themselves. Johannes Hevelius, in the free city of Danzig, built one of the finest observatories in Europe and produced star catalogues of unprecedented accuracy. He corresponded with astronomers across the continent, sharing his findings with those he trusted, building a web of knowledge that no single authority could suppress. Christian Huygens, in the Dutch Republic where censorship was lighter, discovered the rings of Saturn and the largest moon of that distant world. His findings circulated through the networks, reaching scholars in countries where such observations could not have been made or published. Giovanni Alfonso Borelli, in Italy, conducted observations and experiments that supported the Copernican system while carefully avoiding direct statements that would bring the Inquisition to his door. He wrote in the language of hypothesis and speculation, presenting what he knew as mere possibilities to be considered rather than truths to be proclaimed. Each of these men understood that they were custodians of something precious, knowledge that the powers of their age wished to suppress, knowledge that would reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. They preserved it not through grand gestures, but through patient labor, careful correspondence, and the quiet courage of continuing to observe what they were forbidden to believe. The instruments themselves were sometimes hidden. Telescopes, in the decades after Galileo, carried a dangerous reputation. To own one was to invite suspicion. To use one for astronomical observation was to declare an interest in questions that the Church preferred remain unasked. Some astronomers concealed their instruments, bringing them out only at night, conducting their observations in secret, recording their findings in notebooks that would not be shown to visitors. It is said that certain scholars developed techniques for dismantling their telescopes quickly, storing the components separately so that no single search would reveal what they possessed. Others built observatories in private estates, far from cities where authorities might take notice. Still others conducted their most sensitive observations while traveling, in places where they were unknown and their activities would not be reported. The lengths to which they went seem almost absurd to modern eyes. But the danger was real, and the punishment for transgression was severe. These were not paranoid fantasies, but rational responses to a world where truth could be treated as crime. And yet, slowly, the darkness began to lift. In 1660, the Invisible College emerged from shadow to become the Royal Society of London, granted a charter by King Charles VI. The new institution provided a measure of protection for natural philosophers, a forum where ideas could be shared more openly, a publication venue for findings that might otherwise have remained hidden. Similar academies formed across Europe. The Académie des Sciences in Paris, the Academia Naturae Curiosarum in Germany. The networks that had sustained the new astronomy in secret began to operate in daylight. The coded letters gave way to published journals. The hidden telescopes emerged from their concealment. By the end of the 17th century, the Copernican system was no longer dangerous to profess. Isaac Newton's Principia, published in 1687, provided such overwhelming mathematical support for a sun-centered cosmos that denial became increasingly untenable. The Church itself, gradually, quietly, ceased to enforce the prohibitions that had silenced Galileo. But the transition was slow. The index of forbidden books continued to list Copernican works until 1758. Galileo's Dialogue, the book for which he had been condemned, remained banned until 1835. The scars of suppression faded gradually, and some never fully healed. Let us end as we began, in a darkened study, late at night. An astronomer sits at his telescope, the room lit only by a single candle whose flame he shields so it will not spoil his night vision. Through the eyepiece, he watches a planet move against the background of fixed stars, tracking its position, recording numbers in a notebook that rests on his knee. He writes in a private shorthand. The notebook will not be published in his lifetime. Perhaps his children will find it after his death, or his students, or scholars who come later still. Perhaps the observations he makes tonight will contribute, in some small way, to the edifice of knowledge that future generations will inherit. He does not know this. He knows only that the truth matters, that what he sees through the glass is real, regardless of what any authority declares, that the earth moves, the sun stands central, and the stars are further away than any human being had imagined before his century opened its eyes. The stars he watches do not know they are forbidden. The universe does not care about the fears of priests and princes. The planets continue their ancient dance, indifferent to the risks their observers take to witness it. And slowly, slowly, the truth moves toward daylight. carried by those who understood that some knowledge is worth any silence. 11. The Stargazers of the Forbidden City. Behind the vermilion walls of Beijing, in the hours before dawn, when the city still sleeps beneath a canopy of fading stars, there once ascended a procession of scholars whose duty weighed heavier than any generals or ministers. They climbed the stone steps of the imperial observatory in silence, their robes brushing against ancient instruments of bronze and jade, their eyes already lifted toward a sky that held the fate of empires. These were the astronomers of the Forbidden City, and their task was nothing less than maintaining the harmony between heaven and earth. It is said that in China the sky was never merely a ceiling of distant lights. It was a mirror, a message, a continuous revelation of divine intention that could be read, if one had been trained in its language, as clearly as any scroll or decree. The movements of planets foretold the rise and fall of ministers. The appearance of comets announced disasters yet to come. And eclipses, those terrifying moments when the sun or moon was devoured by shadow, could signal that the mandate of heaven itself was slipping from the emperor's grasp. To predict these events, to prepare the court for what the sky would bring, to demonstrate that the emperor still ruled in accordance with cosmic law. This was the burden carried by the astronomers who watched from the platform above the Forbidden City, and they carried it for more than 2,000 years, creating the longest continuous astronomical record in human history. Let us enter that platform now, in the quiet hours when the work was done. The ancient observatory of Beijing stands today home much as it has stood for centuries. A stone terrace rising above the city, crowded with instruments whose bronze surfaces have weathered to a deep green patina. These are not the delicate apparatus of modern science. They are monuments, armillary spheres larger than a man, their interlocking rings representing the celestial equator, the ecliptic, the horizon. Celestial globes mapped with constellations whose names carry meanings lost to most modern ears. Quadrants and sextants designed to measure the altitude of stars with a precision that still impresses those who study their calibrations. Some of these instruments date to the 13th century, when Kublai Khan ordered the construction of an observatory to serve his newly established Yuan dynasty. Others were added in later centuries, their designs remaining essentially unchanged because tradition was itself a form of cosmic order. To alter the instruments would be to suggest that the ancients had been wrong, a dangerous implication in a culture that revered continuity above innovation. The astronomers who used these instruments were not mere observers. They were officials of the imperial court, members of the Bureau of Astronomy, civil servants whose careers depended on the accuracy of their predictions. Each night, they ascended the platform and took their positions at the instruments. Each night, they measured the positions of planets, tracked the slow drift of stars, watched for anything unusual, a comet's tail, a meteor's streak, the troubling dimming of a familiar light. And each morning, they descended with their notebooks and filed their observations in archives that stretched back through dynasty after dynasty, a continuous chain of watching that linked the astronomers of the Qing to those of the Ming to the Yuan to the Song, backward through time to the Han dynasty and beyond, to records that predated the birth of Christ by centuries. The responsibility was immense. Whispers tell us that to fail in predicting an eclipse was not merely embarrassing. It could be interpreted as evidence that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, that divine approval for his rule was withdrawing, that rebellion and disaster would follow. Astronomers who missed eclipses could be demoted, imprisoned, or worse. The sky was not a subject of idle curiosity. It was a matter of state security. This pressure produced extraordinary diligence. Chinese astronomers recorded celestial events that their counterparts elsewhere never noticed or failed to preserve. They observed Halley's comet on every appearance from 240 BCE onward, creating a continuous record that allowed later scientists to calculate its orbit with precision. They noted the supernova of 1054, the stellar explosion that created the Crab Nebula, describing a guest star so bright it was visible in daylight for weeks. European astronomers, if they noticed it at all, left no surviving records. The archives of the Bureau of Astronomy contained observation of sunspots, auroras, meteor showers, planetary conjunctions, phenomena that modern astrophysicists have mined for data about the history of our solar system and galaxy. What began as an effort to read the will of heaven became, inadvertently, a scientific treasure of incalculable value. But the astronomers themselves did not think of their work in scientific terms. They thought of it as divination, as duty, as the sacred obligation to ensure that the emperor ruled in harmony with the cosmos, that the calendar remained accurate, that the seasons arrived when they should, that the great wheel of heaven and the affairs of men turned together in their appointed courses. In the 16th century, a strange fusion began. Jesuit missionaries arrived in China, bringing with them European astronomical knowledge that had been transformed by Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. They came seeking converts, but they gained access to the imperial court through their celestial expertise. When Chinese astronomers failed to accurately predict an eclipse and the Jesuits succeeded, the foreigners were appointed to positions in the Bureau of Astronomy itself. It was an extraordinary moment. European priests working alongside Chinese scholars in the shadow of the Forbidden City, blending traditions that had developed independently for millennia. The Jesuits introduced new instruments, new mathematical techniques, new ways of understanding planetary motion. But they also adapted to Chinese conventions, expressing their findings in terms that the imperial court could accept. Navigating the delicate politics of a civilization that valued tradition above all else. The observatory we see today bears the marks of this encounter. Bronze instruments designed by Jesuit astronomers stand alongside those of Chinese manufacture, their European origins visible in their different styling even as they serve the same purpose. Watching the sky, predicting its changes, maintaining the harmony that the empire required. Some believe this fusion represented a missed opportunity, a moment when East and West might have combined their knowledge to advance understanding faster than either could alone. Others see it as a testament to the universal human impulse to watch the stars, to seek meaning in their movements, to feel that what happens above must somehow matter to what happens below. Beneath the silence of the observatory, both traditions continue to whisper. The sun rises now over the Forbidden City. The vermilion walls catch the first light, glowing like embers against the grey Beijing sky. The astronomers who watch through the night begin their descent from the platform, carrying notebooks filled with the observations they will file in archives that already contain centuries of similar records. Their robes are damp with dew. Their eyes are tired from hours of careful watching. But their duty, for now, is fulfilled. The sky has been read. The mandate remains secure. The calendar will be accurate. The eclipses that approach have been predicted, and the court will be prepared. And in the archives, another night's observations join the countless others. Another thread in a tapestry of watching that stretches back beyond the memory of any living person, beyond the dynasty that currently rules, beyond the dynasties that came before, back to a time when the first astronomers looked up and decided that the movements of heaven must mean something, must matter, must be recorded against the day when their significance would be understood. The stars do not know they are being watched. The planets continue their ancient courses without regard for the empires that track them. The comets appear and disappear according to orbits that care nothing for the fortunes of kings. The universe unfolds in its vast indifference. And yet, generation after generation, century after century, the watchers continue to watch. Perhaps there is something sacred in that persistence, something that transcends the political anxieties that motivated the Bureau of Astronomy, the fears about mandates and dynasties, and the approval of heaven. Perhaps the simple act of watching, of recording, of caring enough to note what happens in the night sky carries its own meaning, a declaration that we are here, that we notice, that we try to understand. The platform stands empty now. The bronze instruments have become museum pieces, admired by tourists who know little of their history. The astronomers who once climbed these steps have returned to dust, their names preserved only in the archives they helped to fill. But the stars remain. The same stars that the Han astronomers watched, that the Tang astronomers recorded, that the Ming astronomers tracked with instruments of bronze and jade. They wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, keeping faith with cycles older than any empire, older than any city, older than humanity itself. And somewhere in the archives of Beijing, the records wait. 2,000 years of watching, filed away in careful order, testifying to a devotion that outlasted every dynasty that sustained it. The sky has been read. The mandate continues. And the stars, as always, keep their own counsel. 12. The last temple. Before forgetting, there is a moment in the long story of human watching when the sky began to disappear. It happened slowly at first, then all at once. A gas lamp here, an electric bulb there. Streets illuminated for safety, factories blazing through the night, cities spreading their glow upward until the stars themselves seemed to fade. Not because they had dimmed, but because we had drowned them in our own artificial light. Within a single century, the sky that had guided humanity since before we had words became invisible to most of the people on Earth. The Milky Way, which had arched overhead every clear night for 100,000 years. That river of light our ancestors called by 1,000 names, wove into 1,000 myths, used to navigate oceans and deserts and the long passages of time, became something most children have never seen. This is not a story of tragedy. The electric light brought safety, productivity, the extension of waking hours into the darkness. But something was lost in that bargain. Something ancient and irreplaceable went silent when the stars disappeared from our common view. This final chapter is a meditation on that loss, and perhaps, quietly, on what might still be recovered. What did it mean to live beneath a visible heaven? We who have grown up in cities cannot easily imagine it. We have seen photographs of the Milky Way, images taken in remote deserts, or from mountaintops, where the old darkness still lingers. But a photograph is not the same as presence. It does not convey the weight of standing beneath a sky so thick with stars that the darkness between them seems the exception rather than the rule. It is said that in ancient times, a person could navigate by starlight alone. The constellations rose and set in predictable patterns, marking the seasons, the hours, the directions of travel. Sailors steered by the stars, farmers planted by them, priests read the future in their configurations. The sky was not decoration, it was infrastructure, as essential to daily life as the roads and rivers and fields that sustained civilization. And beyond the practical, there was the numinous, the feeling that the heavens were not empty but inhabited, that the lights above were not merely burning gases but presences, gods walking slowly across an infinite ceiling, ancestors transformed into eternal light, messages written in a language that patient study might decode. Every culture that left records spoke of the sky with reverence. The Egyptians aligned their pyramids to the stars. The Maya built observatories to track Venus. The Babylonians catalogued celestial omens. The Chinese watched for comets that might foretell the fall of dynasties. The Greeks saw heroes and monsters in the constellations. The Aboriginal Australians traced songlines across the Milky Way. The Polynesians navigated thousands of miles of open ocean by reading the stars' positions. This was not superstition. It was relationship, a continuous conversation between humanity and the cosmos that had begun before history and continued, unbroken, until the lights came on. The knowledge did not vanish entirely. It dispersed. It flowed into scientific journals written in specialized language, read by few. It settled into museums where bronze astrolabes and jade celestial spheres gathered dust behind glass, their purposes explained on the small plaques that most visitors skim past. It migrated into digital archives where star catalogues containing millions of entries are stored on servers that hum in climate-controlled rooms, tended by algorithms rather than human eyes. The ancient observatories became ruins. Stonehenge, which had marked the solstices for 4,000 years, became a tourist attraction roped off from touching. The great sextant of Ulugh Beg filled with rubble and was forgotten for centuries. The stone circles of Scotland and Ireland were ploughed under for farmland, their alignments lost before anyone thought to record them. The astronomers themselves changed. They no longer watched the sky with naked eyes, but through instruments of increasing complexity, telescopes that gathered light from billions of years away, detectors that registered wavelengths invisible to human perception. The universe they studied grew larger and stranger, but also more abstract, more removed from the direct experience of standing beneath the stars and feeling small. Whispers tell us that most professional astronomers today have never seen the Milky Way with their own eyes. They work with data, with images taken by machines, with mathematical models of phenomena too distant or too faint for direct observation. The sky they study is not the sky their ancestors watched. This is not a criticism. The science is extraordinary. We have learned more about the universe in the past century than in all previous human history. We have sent machines to other planets, detected gravitational waves from colliding black holes, photographed the shadows of objects so massive that light itself cannot escape them. But something has been lost. The thread that connected the child looking up in wonder to the astronomer, priest reading omens in the stars, has grown very thin. And yet, in remote corners of the earth, the ancient view remains. In deserts where no city lights intrude, on islands far from shipping lanes, in mountain valleys where the air is thin and the darkness complete. In these places, a person can still stand as the watchers once stood and see what they saw. The International Dark Sky Association has designated certain places as sanctuaries, parks and reserves where artificial lighting is controlled, where the night sky is protected as the natural heritage it is. Cherry Springs in Pennsylvania, Aoraki Mackenzie in New Zealand, Namibrand in the African desert. Places where a visitor can look up and see, perhaps for the first time, what every human being before the 19th century saw every clear night of their lives. The experience, those who have had it say, is overwhelming. Not just the beauty, though the beauty is staggering, but the scale, the feeling of the earth as a small sphere hanging in an immensity of light and darkness. The intuition, arriving not through reason, but through direct perception, that we are part of something vast beyond comprehension. This is what the ancient watchers knew. This is what the temples were built to honor. This is what was lost when the sky went dark. The temples still stand. Stonehenge still marks the solstices, though the ceremonies that once attended them have dissolved into silence. Newgrange still admits the winter solstice sunrise into its inner chamber, though no one now knows what prayers were spoken when the light arrived. The pyramids still align with Orion's belt, though the priests, who designed that alignment, left no explanation of its meaning. The alignments still function. The stones still point to the places on the horizon where significant celestial events occur. The astronomical knowledge encoded in these monuments has not become false, only forgotten, only waiting. And the stars themselves have not changed. Orion still rises in winter as he has risen for 100,000 years. The Pleiades still appear in autumn. The pole star still marks the north. The cycles continue, patient and precise and indifferent to whether anyone watches. Let us close with a single image. A child in a city, walking home at night. The streets are bright with artificial light. The stars are mostly invisible, washed out by the glow. But there, between two tall buildings, a gap in the illumination, and through it, 3 stars in a row. Orion's belt, the hunter who has stalked across the winter sky since before humans had names for constellations. Visible even here, even now, even in the midst of our self-made brightness. The child pauses, looks up, feels something stir, curiosity, wonder, the faint echo of a connection that stretches back through every generation that has ever lived. The child does not know the stories, does not know the myths, does not know that those 3 stars have guided sailors and inspired poets and marked the passage of seasons since before the pyramids were built. But the child sees them, and for a moment the thread holds. The temples wait in their patience of stone. The alignments still function for those who remember how to read them. The dark sky sanctuaries still offer the ancient view to those who journey far enough to find them. And somewhere tonight, someone is watching. Someone is wondering. Someone is feeling the slow awe that humans have felt since the first eyes turned upward and saw light in the darkness. The sky has not abandoned us. We have only turned away. Perhaps, in time, we will remember how to look up again. Perhaps the temples will find new watchers. Perhaps the thread will thicken once more. And the conversation that sustained 100,000 generations will resume. The stars are patient. They have waited through ice ages and extinctions, through the rise and fall of countless species. They can wait for us. And if we listen, if we find the dark places and the quiet hours, if we let our eyes adjust and our minds grow still, Perhaps we will hear again what the ancient watchers heard. The whisper of the cosmos, the breath of distant suns, the invitation that has never been withdrawn. Come outside. Look up. Remember, the sky is still speaking. We have only to learn once more how to hear.